Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Claudia. So thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to the BAVS at Home series on Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom. First, we'd like to thank the British Association for Victorian Studies for sponsoring this event, and especially to Dr. Claire Woods, who organized the BAVS at Home series. And as Claudia mentioned, we have the first section of our presentation. We'll introduce the project at large, followed by a more focused presentation on different parts of our project and websites, the Zoom casts, the lesson plans, and the syllabus clusters. And then the second section will be a Q&A moderated by Claudia Capancioni. And so feel free to post your questions on the chat as we go along, or you can wait to pose your questions after the presentation portion. And then finally, as Claudia explained, around the 45-minute mark, we will open discussions with you about possible future directions and initiatives that our project can take. So my name is Chaozon Bauer from Notre Dame de Namur University, and I'll provide a very brief overview of Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom. And for people who are not familiar with UVC, it's an open access digital humanities project that really fosters the application of innovative interdisciplinary teaching approaches by introducing less studied, global, Victorian era writers, artists, and communities into the classroom. We're really trying to push against what is deemed literary. And so we were founded as a collaboration among 4 Victorianist scholars from different kinds of institutions across the United States. And we're committed to working in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the national and global initiatives to challenge racist and xenophobic violence. So originally our project was inspired and built on the interventions made by Ranjani Chatterjee, Alicia Morales-Christoph, and Amy R. Wong's essay, Undisciplining Victorian Studies, which came out last July, which itself builds on Christina Sharp's call for scholars to become undisciplined and undoing the racist epistemologies that all of us have inherited, unknowingly or not, from our predecessors. And so given to our commitment to anti-racism and coalition building, we really make every effort to reach consensus through a collaborative model of community based on care. And what that means is we place the needs of our most vulnerable students and colleagues at the core of our work, while simultaneously honoring the knowledge and expertise of scholars of color, of scholars who share our critical priorities, and of fields that have grappled with race as a central concern. And so we understand our project as extending forms of radical care in 3 ways. First, to the field of Victorian studies, a field that has been historically hostile to new knowledges and scholars of color. 2, to our students who demand more diverse content and methodologies. And finally, to each other and our contributors. You know, we're all at various stages of our careers and we have different support systems. So we're trying to create this community where we can all come together and grow together. And so in this vein, we also seek to promote the work of BIPOC and BAME scholars, early career scholars, and contingent faculty, all of whom we know are structurally vulnerable and require specific forms of care as they confront the effects of neoliberalism on higher education. And this commitment to equity further informs the technical design of our site, which incorporates features to support accessibility for multiple audiences, including people with disabilities. So from our conceptual underpinnings to our site's digital coding, we developed our project in the hope that Victorian studies and academia writ large can start to become the equitable, anti-racist space we imagine it to be. And so now I'm going to move your attention to Ryan Fong, who's going to talk a little bit more about our Zoomcasts. So Ryan, take it away. Yours on mute.
Thanks, Pearl. So in terms of thinking about how we wanted to develop the content for our site, one of the things that we really confronted early on was that it was important for us to think very carefully about form in terms of what kind of content would go up onto the site. And we realized that we needed to develop some new genres to accomplish the goals that Pearl laid out in terms of not only thinking about new teaching methodologies and integrating new content, but to do this work of, and I'll repeat this over and over again, of kind of learning and unlearning. The ways that so many of us were taught within Victorian studies has kind of pigeonholed us and kept us blind to some of the contributions that are being made by other fields elsewhere. And we really see the call of Undisciplining Victorian Studies, the essay, to engage in this process of learning and unlearning. And so while formats like the scholarly article or even more informally written pieces like the think piece or the reading list have been and remain really useful for us, what we wanted to do was develop forms of content that really stage and facilitate on the site the process of undisciplining, this process of learning and unlearning. So we wanted to make sure that we gave people concrete tools to undertake this work, and we wanted to help engage in conversations and really make explicit what this work looks like as we kind of do the meta thinking about this. And the Zoomcast forum was one that really was developed to undertake and stage this meta thinking. And is developed as a hybrid between the traditional podcasts that we all know and love and conversations like this one that were taking place with increasing frequency in our COVID virtual environment. We noticed that we were meeting a lot on Zoom, having conversations, and really wanted to kind of mine and focus that particular and shape that particular form to create a space of informal conversation between colleagues about how we were undertaking the work of undisciplining. So even if we hadn't always called it that or framed it that in this particular way, the conversations in the Zoomcast, what we wanted to do was record these instances where we could just think and talk together about what we'd done, what we were trying out, what were some of the feelings of vulnerability that we had, what were some of the anxieties that we had, what were some of the challenges that we faced, and also importantly, what were some of the successes that we were having. And the idea here was to really emphasize the importance of learning and growing together as a field. As Pearl said, you know, really at the heart of our project is this ethic of care, the fact that we need to support one another in our structural vulnerabilities within our institutions and in the world, and to support one another in our mutual learning as a field. And to acknowledge the different forms of inequality and oppression that have structured our field and structured the academy. So we really wanted to highlight in the Zoomcast format this kind of collaborative, collective process that happens rather than just us sitting at our computers alone, kind of hammering out our syllabi or lesson plans in isolation. So the first Zoomcast that we published on our site settled kind of into two clusters. So the first is a series of conversations about positionality that Pearl led with scholars and particularly scholars of color and engaging in conversations about how they've seen and positioned themselves in relation to Victorian studies, how they entered the field, what the work has looked like, what the challenges that they faced have looked like. And also to really confront head on the kind of racial dynamics that have shaped the field. So we talked to Tricia Lutens, a white scholar who's been doing this work at Georgia for a long time and kind of how she has been thinking about this. And then we talked to two scholars of color, Zarina Aslami and Alicia Walters, about how their work at their respective institutions and how they're shaping their research questions, which then spills over into their classroom practices and shapes their thinking about the field. The second series has been about finding and approaching new content in this work of undisciplining, especially around teaching. And in particular, it highlights something that Pearl underscored in her introduction, which was the importance of moving beyond Eurocentric categories of what counts as quote unquote literary. So the novel, the poem, the play, things that we think that we know and are stable forms. And the importance of looking beyond these categories or perhaps rethinking these categories to look at other kinds of sources and materials in order to do the work of undisciplining, that different communities and people around the world might not be operating in those categories. So what does it mean to engage with those, to look for those and think about that? And so we've initially started with two podcasts about that. One with Jason Rudy that I had about using visual art in studying 19th century Aboriginal cultures in Australia. And then another conversation that we had with the founders of the Digital Humanities Project Anglophone Chile, which is a huge repository and database of Chilean newspapers from the 19th century, and a lot of materials about how to approach and teach those. So really what we've been trying to do is to highlight the kind of branching out that we all need to be doing as scholars and teachers if we're going to be thinking about undisciplining and learning from these other disciplines in ways to approach these materials responsibly and well. And so as we move forward, we're hoping to expand the scope of these Zoomcasts, not only adding more content, but developing within the clusters we have, but developing new ones. And again, it's all about that process of showcasing and modeling these processes of learning and unlearning. So now I'll turn things over to Adrian.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Pearl, too. You both did fantastic work in framing, some of the really foundational conceptual and theoretical elements that inform our project. What we'll be doing kind of in the second half of our presentation is talking about some of the, one could describe as more practical elements that have come out of the project. In terms of just actual day-to-day practice in the classroom. I in particular wanted to speak about the lesson plans. The lesson plans are the second kind of content that we generated for our site. They're organized into clusters and can focus around various kinds of things. So there are no limitations to the kind of scope that these lesson plans can take. This can focus on an author, a text, a theme, a topic. And the way that we've set up our lesson plans is that they have several different components. It varies from cluster to cluster as well. But the cluster that I worked on had a set of key features. These included primary and secondary texts, critical questions, pedagogical approaches. And the idea behind the lesson plans were that they were created to help scholars as they were developing particular courses or particular components of courses. So what we produce through the project can be taken as is in various chunks and incorporated into existing syllabi. It can also serve as a kind of springboard for scholars who are thinking about changing a course or components of their course. We give them various kinds of ideas, various kinds of primary and secondary texts, various kinds of critical approaches to working on their content. And then finally, the thing I wanted to mention about the lesson plans too, and this really kind of gets to the point that Ryan was just emphasizing, is that the lesson plans were created through a process that models the kind of care that we're also envisioning through the project as a whole, by which I mean for each set of lesson plans, both the ones that I led and the one that Sophia led, Sophia and I engage with a set of scholars at various sorts of stages in their careers through a year-long set of meetings that happen every other week or so that could last more than an hour or two. And that brought us together to talk about the kinds of practices we were engaging in the classroom, the ways that we were engaging in these practices, thinking about how these practices could be changed and informed and developed by scholarship from other disciplines, by new developments in Victorian studies, with an eye on centering race and with an eye on rethinking how we taught both authors that have traditionally been included in the canon as well as authors that are not normally included in the canon. Each of our lesson plans is led by one, or was led by one person / created by one person, but it also bears the mark of a very rigorous and ongoing process of peer review. Everyone else involved in the lesson plan was regularly interacting with the scholar, developing their particular lesson plan, and really serving as a kind of vigorous sounding board for developing ideas, for critically reflecting on different aspects of the lesson plan. The two sets of lesson plans that we've developed so far are the one that I've done, which focuses on Mary Seacole and the Caribbean, and the one that Sophia led, which focuses on Africa, diaspora, and the British Empire. It's also worth mentioning in this context that my group now is independently developing a lesson plan on Mary Seacole, and we're also looking at a lesson plan on the Victorians in relation to Northern Africa and the Middle East. One additional element that I wanted to emphasize in terms of my lesson plans, or the lesson plans that I developed with my group, is that they're organized in such a way that they follow a predictable structure. Each opening section of the lesson plan sets out a series of learning outcomes envisioned for that lesson plan, and then offers one or more pathways into engaging with that material. And by pathways, we mean approaches that focus on specific sets of texts or specific sets of ideas. This set of pathways is then followed by a number of suggested contemporary topics that can allow the scholars using this lesson plan to connect Victorian subjects to various subjects related to the very kind of present day. And then we offer a range of curated materials. In some cases, these materials will be annotated material by material, so text by text. In other cases, they'll be annotated at a more general level. And the materials will include primary texts from the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, essays on culture, criticism, and theory, and then suggested further reading. And so, as I mentioned earlier, one of the ideas here is to either enable scholars who want to add a particular topic or theme to their existing syllabus to go ahead and directly take what they find useful from our lesson plans, or simply to look at our lesson plans and think about how they might be inspired in revising and redeveloping what they already have. One final thing I wanted to do is just very quickly share the screen and let you all see what one of these lesson plans looks like. This is one created by Heidi Kaufman from the University of Oregon. It's titled Undisciplining Victorian Autobiography. And what you have at the top is various details related to the lesson plan. We have a menu, then we have a summary of the learning outcomes. We have pathways, and so in this case, you can see the particular pathways that Heidi has chosen to organize in relation to her lesson plan. There are recommended texts for each pathway, a summary of the pathway. We use some quotes from the given author that we're looking at to kind of exemplify ideas related to the pathway. And then finally, we have related contemporary topics, and we close with a series of suggested materials. And as you can see here, these focus on the 19th and 20th centuries, beyond, move into critical work, and then close with some further reading. And then there are some other details related to the given page. So thank you very much. I'd like to turn the floor over to Sophia Xu, who will discuss the last aspect of our project.
So before I get started, I just want to make sure that we're okay on time, because my Zoom says there's only 5 minutes left. Do we need to do anything about this?
Hi folks, let me just come in there. Behind the scenes, we have upgraded the account, but it just seems to be taking a moment to come through. What I'm going to do is pop a link in the chat here to a follow-on meeting. So if those changes don't take effect, we'll all just have to hop over. And I really do apologize for that inconvenience.
Okay, so I will just carry on and see what happens. So yeah, I'm going to talk about our last form of content, which are the peer-reviewed syllabi, and those are organized around specific themes that seek to challenge and expand traditional ideas of Victorian studies. Introducing H syllabus is a short essay that expounds upon the critical framing of the syllabus, kind of making explicit what Ryan talked about before, the process of developing syllabi, the process of undisciplining our classrooms, you know, kind of to think through how an undisciplined approach to teaching Victorian studies really informs course design, the selection of materials, assignment construction, stuff like that. And so by peer reviewing the syllabi in short essays, we're really aiming to treat pedagogical materials as rigorously as our field has done more traditional forms of scholarship, like the journal articles, monographs, conference presentations. The goal is not only to elevate and innovate our teaching practices, but also to recognize those who are already engaging in undisciplined and anti-racist methods with their students. I would say that, you know, to think through our process more, we really developed this open peer review system for our peer reviewed syllabi. We really wanted to rethink the peer review in terms of, what my other organizers have called our ethics of care. And through our open peer review system, we hope to retain the best parts of peer review, right, to verify content, to ensure scholars are accountable to recent past scholarship, to help improve the quality of published work, while eliminating the more problematic aspects of blind peer review, right, that it can often be a form of gatekeeping, that it can perpetuate structures of academic elitism, that it can replicate gendered and racial biases under the guise of neutrality, and that it relies really on uncredited academic labor. And so through our open peer review process, we hope to turn peer review into a form of collaboration that aligns with care ethics and the equitable model of scholarly community that we aim to build. And naming everyone involved, moreover, we recognize people for their labor and expertise. In the spring, we published, sorry, I'm just gonna copy this Zoom meeting before I forget in case. So in the spring, we published one cluster of syllabi under the title Recontextualizing the Victorians. And this cluster of syllabi demonstrates the value of recontextualizing the Victorians by drawing out the forgotten and oftentimes suppressed connections between the past and the present, as well as between 19th century cultures and communities. Through concepts and frameworks from critical race theory, Black studies, post-colonial studies, and Indigenous studies, these syllabi disrupt the geographic and temporal boundaries of Victorian studies in order to remake the field for our students and ourselves. The two syllabi featured in that cluster are one by Priyanka Ann Jacobs called Reintroducing the Victorians, and that syllabus resituates Victorian literature in our present moment by teaching it through a polyphonic, global, and intersectional lens. Whereas the second syllabus featured in that cluster is by Margaret Lindley, and that one decolonizes the teaching of Victorian literature through theoretical frameworks from Indigenous, settler colonial, post-colonial, and eco-critical studies. And Margaret's syllabus was called Unsettling Victorian Literature. To give you a preview of some syllabi that we will be publishing in the future, we have a cluster that we're developing on gender and empire, another on Black studies and Victorian studies, and then the third one on deconstructing the literary canon. In terms of when that first half of the meeting ended, so the formal part of our presentation is now over, and so we can open up the floor actually to Q&A right now.
Sophia, your closing was amazing. It was literally right.
I didn't know whether, however, you want to maybe remind us of the forthcoming syllabi, but that's what you finished on.
Yes, so I in the previous half of the meeting, I just very, briefly explained what the peer-reviewed syllabi are, the kind of process that we go through in peer reviewing those syllabi, and then also discussing briefly what we already have on the website, which is the cluster on recontextualizing the Victorians, and we have 3 more syllabi cluster in development right now, one on gender and empire, another on Black studies, and Victorian studies, and another one on deconstructing the canon. And so yes, now we are ready.
And I'll just add a big thank you to Elaine Friedgood for being the peer reviewer on our first cluster of syllabi. She was, in that spirit of open peer review, she generously responded to Priyanka and Margaret's syllabi.
Claudia, you're unmuted, so.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're ready for questions then, for a Q&A session to begin with before we open to an open discussion on suggestions and ideas. So kind of replicating the model that you've been describing to us a little, I think. Okay, I'll check the chat. I don't think there are questions in the chat yet, but I'm seeing participants are getting back. I think I'll start with what I want to know more about is how much you all enjoyed being part of this, because it sounds to me an amazing experience in so many different layers, different levels. So maybe we can start with that, and so you might kind of inspire us all to either join you, if that's possible, in this adventure, or set up something similar, because it just sounds amazing. A lot of the things you've been discussing about, I've been talking about with colleagues, and thinking about, I've just rethought one of the programs I lead in terms of as I think Sophia particularly was talking about, in terms of the aligning of assessment, the lesson plans, and then how you actually transparently show the meta thinking behind it, and how the process it are at the basis of organizing very complex knowledge, but also that the sharing of that knowledge. I had so many things in my head, but I think most of all is that because I've enjoyed this so much, and I think it's one of the aspects of what's happening at present that really makes it exciting to be in our field of studies. So maybe if you want to share with us how you found it.
Yeah, I will start. Actually, I'll start with really how this project came to be. We were in in the midst of a pandemic, as you recall, last summer, and then the Black Lives Movement protests were also undergoing, and so many changes happening all at once. And I felt like Victorian studies as a field, NAVSA as an organization, I felt like we needed to respond to that, especially in light of the Undisciplining the Victorian Studies essay. And so I had reached out to NAVSA about potentially doing something, workshops or an event that really spoke to how this impacts our teaching and what how our teaching should shift through this. And then quickly, I was connected to Adrian Wisnicki, who was also doing this kind of work through NAVSA, right? Adrian, I think Adrian was doing already organizing some kind of workshop, and I had mentioned to him. Oh,
I was just going to say that's right. It was a panel that we actually ended up sponsoring jointly with NAVSA and BAVS. Joe Taylor was involved in that, and Carolyn Berman, and that was in January sometime, last January.
Yes, exactly. And then we quickly I had mentioned to him that creating a website or a digital humanities project would be ideal. And he was also very excited about that process and that project. And then we quickly brought in Ryan and Sophia, and immediately the four of us just got along so well. We met through Zoom almost every week, and everybody had been feeling isolated because of the pandemic. And I think all of us have mentioned multiple times how this project has made us feel so much more alive. And for me specifically, I've been frustrated and complaining about all of these issues in Victorian studies, and Understanding the Victorian classroom has felt so empowering. I feel like now I have this voice to change the field, and we're seeing it change in so many amazing ways. And I really feel like, not only this project, but the fact that everybody has come together and collaborated, like you said, Claudia, I think that has been the most exciting thing. And really that the four of us just work so well, like no fights whatsoever. And it's really just been a joy. So anyone else wants to share?
I'll just add, just to echo that it's been a real pleasure. And I think the source of the pleasure for me, aside from the wonderful individuals that have been involved, was that our impetus going in was I think so many questions around the pandemic and teaching became very quickly bureaucratized, right? So it was what are the best practices? What do we need to do? And instead we were starting from the question of we're committed to this work, and how can we support each other in making it happen? How can we learn from what we already know? How can we reach out to other people that might know more than us? How can we kind of add in this human dimension? And one of the things that I've appreciated about the project, and why we're hoping to have this discussion about where future directions, is that we never wanted this to just be the four of us coming up with the solution or the content. This was always designed to be collaborative, to create clusters of people who are interested in starting something, right? So that it was like, well, what do you want to work on? And it's like, well, I really want to teach MarySQL. Well, let's start working on that together. And really approaching the work in that way. And in this kind of organic way. And so we see the site as this framework that we've created now, where groups of people can come in and out, come in for a couple months and put a syllabus together, or put a short group of lesson plans together, or say, hey, I've been doing this, I'd really love to do a Zoomcast on this, where we can kind of integrate this and create a kind of hub for some of these the idea generation, while still keeping this collaborative ethos in mind, that if we're all collaborating together through this platform, then we can generate some really powerful content together. And so and all of this within the backdrop of knowing that we're a new group, right? That we don't have funding, this is volunteer, right? That all of this, but what are the other things that we can offer that will make this fulfilling work, even if we can't offer yet monetary kind of compensation. And so it's like, what will make this feel good and empowering, rather than just that kind of bureaucratic suck of energy that so many of us are combating at our home institutions.
And briefly to add to that, we are in the process of applying for grants to push against this notion of unpaid labor that all of us are sucked into, right? So we really see that as a problem in higher education, and we're really trying to find solutions on how to get people paid for all the work that they're providing for the site and really for each other.
Adrian and Sophia, I don't know whether you want to add something, or whether you like to start kind of answering questions from the audience. Sam is first, and she asks, for the grad students among us who are strictly limited in what we can assign by our teaching directions and or institutions, she kindly just says about, being asked to assign only what are called representative novels and short stories next semester. So she's asking, from that kind of perspective, what are some of the things that we can do to participate in undisciplining and assisting in creating a united front?
I think that's a great question, and I'm happy to provide a preliminary / starting answer. So one thing that's very important to emphasize about our project is that it's not necessarily centered on just introducing new authors into the classroom. We're very much against what we've described in various contexts as a kind of mix and stir approach, where you bring in one or two authors and suddenly your syllabus is diversified. What we're really interested in is modeling a kind of critical process that we bring to teaching, right? Often this kind of critical process might be brought to research, but we're shifting the kind of arena of focus in some ways from these kinds of projects to teaching, so that we can really start at a kind of foundational level, by which I mean working with students, right? Students at all levels, to think about not only the text we're teaching, but the ways in which we're teaching them. And this is really, where in some ways we take a lot of inspiration from the original Undisciplining Victorian Studies essay, with the emphasis being on going outside to other disciplines, other ways of knowing, other ways of thinking. And so, if like you're a scholar working in a kind of context where the curriculum in terms of primary text is handed to you and you're expected to teach a certain kind of course, that doesn't preclude you from approaching those texts in various kinds of ways. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do through the project is to model ways in which that could be done in conceptual ways, but also in ways that can be applied in any given classroom setting. So our lesson plans, for example, and this is true for the syllabi as well, give you a series of primary texts you could be introducing into the classroom, but we also give you secondary texts of various kinds. And if you're in a kind of context where you can't bring in those secondary texts, there's certainly nothing to stop you from reading them and using those texts to inform your discussion. And you can go into this at any kind of depth that you want. Often what we were thinking about, and this is kind of going back to the earlier question, is really kind of providing a community of support and care. And a lot of that centers on the human and working at a very human scale. So one thing that's interesting about our materials is they're created in very kind of small formats in some ways that make them much more accessible and that can be kind of engaged with in more limited ways. And, you know, this supports the various kinds of scholarship, but it also supports scholars working in various kinds of contexts. So for example, if you're a contingent faculty working in a very overburdened context, this is a really easy way for you to expand and develop your thinking without feeling like you have to get heavily engaged in something.
I'll just add to that really quickly some maybe concrete examples from our website. The first one that came to mind was, for me, was Cherry Kwok's Undisciplining the Dramatic Monologue lesson plan, which is part of the Africa, Diaspora, and British Empire cluster. She takes this very canonical form, the dramatic monologue, and shows us the different ways in which we can approach that. And that might be useful in direct ways. You might be teaching dramatic monologues, but that might also be useful in the ways that it models different methodologies. Also say, I think the syllabi that we have up, they use a mix of canonical and non-canonical text. And again, I think the critical essays that frame those syllabi are really explicit in terms of how different methodologies can help uncover different questions in texts that we are so used to already.
And I think Sophia's comment really, I think, touches on Dino's question too, right?
Yeah.
How do we do this work in light of the pressures against teaching, teaching with, with critical race theory in mind? I mean, the reality is that, we do teach, and we must teach in this way, but we can do it in a strategic way. And so even if your syllabus doesn't necessarily have these secondary essays, you can be bringing these in as you're thinking about your lesson plans. And so, I don't know, somebody who's overlooking in a big brother way your materials wouldn't necessarily see the kind of work that you're doing, right? So Undisciplining the Dramatic Monologue is a perfect example.
And I'll just add to, thinking about Dino's question. I mean, I think, I think that question also necessitates thinking very carefully about what different people's positionalities are, right? And what they can and can't do. So I really hear, Sam, in your question, the positionality of the grad student, right? And what can and can't be done, right? And so, I think in those contexts, and I think this is true of kind of various contingent faculty, right? Kind of trying to do this work within potentially strict structures or something like that. I think there's power in this kind of off the grid undisciplining, right? So like, I have to teach Jane Eyre, right? But then what happens when you bring in visual objects, right? That might refract that in different ways, right? Even if you aren't assigning a full critical essay, what happens when you bring in just a paragraph from Said, right? And kind of just start to see what happens, or even just introduce an idea that's informed by Spivak's questions, right? About Jane Eyre, right? Like we do these things, right? But and people have been doing these things for a long time, right? But what are the ways that we might think about injecting that in, right? And then I think for those of us who are privileged enough to be in tenured positions, right, that we also need to be very mindful about what are the opportunities where we can go on the grid, right? And acknowledge our forms of institutional power to say, well, this is a push from these legislatures, and how can we teach in ways that's like, look, this is the way we need to teach, right? And I think as Victorianists, we might have a little bit of an easier time because I think most of the lightning rod issues around critical race theory around US history, right? So I think there's a way we can kind of backdoor and get at some of these things in terms of British history that might do some critical work and some important work. But I think that, again, there's an importance in thinking about when do we need to be visible? When do we need to hold our positions to say, this is what we're doing and this is why it's important.
I do agree fully, Ryan. But would we like to address Louise's question about intersections between undisciplining the classroom and increased accessibility. So, for example, she gives, as a way of thinking about it, thinking about representation, learning styles, and neurodiversity.
I'm going to prompt Adrian to talk about coding and the site and some of the things that we've done in terms of design. But I'll also just say, I mean, this is an area that I think we would love to see developed, right, by people who are more steeped in disability studies than we are, right, to think about how we could do this work within our field to bring conversations around race together with conversations that are taking place in disability studies, right? Like what might that look like? And so again, this is part of that learning. But Adrian can talk about the design of our site and accessibility in terms of that.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you. And Louise, thank you very much for your question. I'll just kind of add in as an aside that, we as a project are very much interested in collaborating with others, and the kind of work that you're already doing could, hint, become the basis for a kind of lesson plan or even just a syllabus that you publish through our website. So that's something to think about, if you're interested in collaborating with us or interested in collaborating with us and organizing a set of scholars to work on a particular topic with you. In terms of this question, just very briefly, we didn't really touch on this in the opening comments, but one of the features of Undisciplining the Victorian Classroom is, as a digital project, it's very much focused on accessibility, and there are various kinds of features built into the website to support accessibility. I'll give a few examples. So one, we try to use a color scheme that is colorblind safe. So there's a website I use to check the colors for the site and make sure that they're accessible to audiences. The site scales for various kinds of devices. So, and you can all test this out right now. If you look at the site on your mobile device, it will work just as well as if you're looking at it on your desktop or laptop. The site is also built to have a very small footprint, so it loads quickly. So for example, if you're in a kind of context where your internet connection is slow, where you have to kind of use the site on a pay-as-you-go basis, it will be a very low-cost experience, and the site should work fairly well even in low bandwidth environments. And then there are kind of built-in features too. So for example, one thing that one can do is, if you are a user who's only accessing the internet through keyboards, you can tab through the entire site to get to the parts that you want. And there are kind of hidden features built in that let you navigate around certain things that repeat through the site and so forth.
If I could add, one of the things, no, I am not muted, good. It's one of the things we are developing for next academic year, where I work, is actually intersecting our expertise at interdisciplinary level across the faculty. So I've been working with education studies specialists to think about accessibility, to think about, that specialist knowledge that they have about child's development and, how you learn and what you need on the basis of, diversity, and but also diversity in terms of availability of access to, knowledge or forms of knowledge. I'm thinking literacy, for example. So there are ways in which, collaborating beyond also our discipline, they're really, fruitful and helpful to think about these intersections and, the tools that we want to be able to use with as many learners as we can. So
I just wanted to echo one thing that Ryan said earlier, and also use that as a way of kind of transitioning us to probably what we need to move on to now, the last segment of the discussion.
It is.
So one thing to keep in mind about this project. So Ryan said, earlier in one of his comments that it was never just going to be about the four of us. We were always interested in building community. is a related point is this project is very much about listening as it is about saying. And we are very interested in hearing from other people about ways that the project can be improved, the ways that materials can be presented on the project, the kinds of materials that can be presented on the project. And so one of the things that we can see for this talk today is to have the last segment really, turn the spotlight on the audience to kind of hear from you all about ways we could develop the project. So I don't know if this is a good place to do that. I think we could kind of transition into this last bit.